In this lecture, we're looking at the First Great Awakening and the rise of a real different movement that came along with the Evangelical Awakening that featured some experimentation with preaching that both gave shape to all of the subsequent history of the evangelical world and which contributed to the breakdown of the institutional church as the sole governing body that could control doctrine and practice in the life of the church. And we can begin by just talking about the key players here in the Awakening. The men we're going to focus on in this lecture, we've already looked at in some detail, men like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. Whitefield and Edwards are the two major players that spark the movement of the Great Awakening, that support it from within their theological framework. And though they both were churchmen in their own right, and though they both supported the life of the church, it is their support of the Great Awakening which gives it so much importance and that ushers in this new age of revivalistic preaching in the New World. And the importance of the Great Awakening is in part due to its interpretation. Historians have always been arguing, almost ever since, as to what the Great Awakening's significance was in the life of America. There are lots of different threads that have been followed. There are lots of different conclusions as to what the final results were. And we can name three of them here. There are three things that historians tend to believe. Some have a pretty wide consensus amongst historians, others do not. But it's often these three things that are cited as the importance of this revivalistic preaching. The first is that this movement, the Great Awakening, is the beginning or the origin of what would eventually become known as fundamentalism. And we're going to look at fundamentalism more specifically in a later lecture. Fundamentalism is the movement that really is reactionary against intellectuals, those in power, whether in the government or in the academy. And it tends to be a ruralization, we might say, of the goals and the aims of the church. It's more out in the territories that are no longer the main players of America. And a lot of historians are not quite sure about this one. The main problem here, of course, is that both men who are really the drivers of the Great Awakening, George Whitefield and Edwards, are themselves not fundamentalist. They are orthodox, they are confessional, they believe many of the same doctrines in many of the same ways that Protestants had always believed from the time of the early 16th century. And so noticing a genealogy from this point of the Great Awakening all the way down until the fundamentalist movement and then end of the 20th century is a bit suspect. It doesn't quite hold water. The second is that it is the Great Awakening, the first one in particular, that sparks the, at least, culture throughout the populace of what would become the American Revolution. Now, the idea here is that the way that the Great Awakening serves to drive people away from institutional authority, away from the higher-ups, the elites of society, in this case, the pastors and the bishops of their churches, and it drives them to come however they will to a non-institutional public preaching of the gospel. The idea here is that this is a populist understanding of the way to do church. It's about bringing everyone together. It's about the simple preaching of the gospel. It flies in the face of a number of church leaders, whether in the Presbyterian church or the Congregational church or in the Anglican church, who did not want the Great Awakening and who challenged it. And there is certainly something to this. Not all historians are convinced at this point, but there is something here about the way the Great Awakening fits hand in glove with the American culture, which says that we are not supposed to trust those in authority fully for everything, and that power and authority, and in some cases, the decisions are to be left in the hands of John Doe and Jane Doe, the average person. Still, though, this is not the political Reformation by any means. The suggestion here by historians is that what the Great Awakening provides is a softening of the pill that America has to swallow as it moves from a British colony to its own republic, with its new invention of a democracy and its new privilege and its new desire to see the average person involved in civil life and in political life, even to the point of the decision-making that is required in government. Again, though, it's not a one-to-one parallel. It's certainly not easy to prove this, at least beyond a shadow of a doubt. The third point, and this is the one we're going to focus on a bit more here, is that the First Great Awakening is the beginning of emotional revivalism. Now, this is obvious. This is very, very clear. There had been some revivals for sure. There had been emotional responses for sure. The Protestant world, in fact, all of church history, is not emotionally dead. The church has always said that people need to be emotionally involved with their faith. What is happening here, though, in the Great Awakening is there is a lurch forward in terms of the privilege of the emotional life for the Christian. The idea here is that those who come to the faith need to do so primarily through the emotions. They need to have these ecstatic experiences, emotional responses of a number of different things. They need to be heartfelt. They need to be very, very ecstatic, to use a word that was very popular in this day. It's not principally a revolution or a revival of the mind. This is not about new doctrines, new thoughts. Though, of course, there's always doctrine that's in play. There are always things that are being discussed at an intellectual level. No, what's going on here is really a privileging of the emotional life. And we've seen this arise as the Reformation has carried on. We saw this in Lutheran pietism, for example, the move from doctrine to emotions. It wasn't so much the adding of one to the other, but rather a replacement of one for the other. Emotions become the central thing. Doctrine and confession become the secondary thing, or sometimes further down the line in terms of its importance for the Christian life. So each in their own way, these three interpretations of the Great Awakening should signal for us some of the ways that historians have approached the subject. We're always concerned, really, not so much with the Great Awakening itself, though it is important and a very interesting time. Rather, it's a bit like the Reformation. Luther and Calvin are interesting on their own, but they're interesting in part, if not primarily, because of the ongoing effects of both of their theologies and both of the movements that their names are attached to. Well, it's that way with the Great Awakening. It's not so much that these are moments in time that sort of stand alone, but rather these are times when a lot of new things are coming into the church, a lot of new desires are being expressed, and a new emotional revivalism is underway in terms of the goals of the church with its evangelism. Now, if those are the instincts of the way we're going to approach this, if these are the goals to see the impact of the Great Awakening, well, what's the context? Well, the context is vitally important to understand because I think for most of us, we tend to misapply or misunderstand what is going on in the American colonies before the Revolutionary era and shortly thereafter. The context is, simply put, that America has gotten a bit fat and a bit lazy. Now, we don't mean that pejoratively, and we don't mean that to be a moral judgment upon the people during this day. But we have to remember, just as the Pilgrims did not come to the New World in and of themselves to suffer hardship, but rather they came because there were so many economic opportunities in the New World. When we get to this period of time, in the mid-1700s, what's going on here is there's actually a great deal of prosperity that has come upon the New World. People have gotten rich, whether it's through the sale of tobacco, sugar, cotton, whether it's through trade, any number of different things. The Americas were a boom town during the 1700s. As a result, people are more wealthy and therefore more leisured. If you add to that the fact that the American slave trade has really taken off and has now become thoroughly ingrained in the life of the Americas, well, a lot of these people who are now wealthy and leisured are also doing so on the backs of very cheap labor, rather through their own sweat and tears. That only compounds the value of all of these farms and production houses, and it contributes to the fact that those who are slave owners, those who are the wealthy, can grow even more wealthy and more leisured as a result of slave labor. This is also a time of pretty intense urbanization. It only makes sense coming out of the Pilgrim and the colonial period. People are going to band together. You really only have a suburban or a ruralization of living arrangements, not only in America, but in other countries around the world throughout history. Whenever the urban populations become more fixed, more established, and sometimes a bit corrupted or different than the values of the people that eventually move out. Put simply, people tend to move away from dense populations whenever more lucrative options are available outside of these urban centers, or whenever they find themselves fundamentally different, culturally, religiously, ethnically at times, from the urban cores where they exist. Now, sometimes this is a good thing. Sometimes there are lands to be conquered and areas to settle, new commerce and new produce to grow, for example. Other times, of course, it's a negative thing. Things like white flight as people leave urban cores because they're becoming too ethnically diverse. Well, in this day and age, it's not really mature to the point that you have a great deal of ruralization or people leaving in large numbers from the urban centers of places like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, etc. It's still really an urban world. Next, and this is a point that's not often believed by the modern world about this period of time, but it had become common in this day and age to accuse those who were more wealthy in these urban centers of becoming distracted and lazy, either in terms of their work life, their political life, or in the case of what's important right here, in terms of their religious life. Now again, I think we tend to always have rose-colored glasses when we're looking on the past. The culture wars, the fights, the troubles in the church or without always seem worse in whatever generation you're living in. And so it always seems to be the case that the time around the American Revolution is something of the high watermark for the Christian faith, at least in terms of North America. Again, we need to add some more color to that portrait. This is the time of the Enlightenment. This is a time when people are losing faith as often as they are gaining it. This is a time when folks are not as open to regular church worship, or at least serious belief, as they had been maybe in the 16th century. And this is on the lips of all the Puritan or North American preachers at one time or another. They're always trying to shake people awake. Stop relying on your prosperity and the luxuries that you can afford. Take seriously your faith. Or for those who have become deistic or atheistic, there's always a call for people to return to the faith. Lastly, though, the context of the First Great Awakening is really at the pregnant moment when all of these denominations in the New World have finally reached a point where they are melting together, and there is a breakdown in the distinctiveness of people that had come from the old world, transplanted in America, and their children or their children's children might no longer identify as being part of the same church as their forefathers and foremothers. This is a day when folks could not so much select which denomination they want to be a part of, though of course they could. This wasn't a time where there was extensive hopping around from church to denomination, as it is so much a lightening of the burden of what it meant to be, say, a Baptist or a Congregationalist or a Presbyterian. And so what's going to happen in the First Great Awakening is the big revivals that are being preached principally up in New England are going to be one of these real serious moments where people come together in a way that they never had before in Protestant history. Now, there are moments, of course, of irenic and ecumenical movements throughout the history of Protestantism. There are times where folks will metaphorically reach across the aisle to someone who is a bit different from them. But these are not real serious mixtures of all kinds of different folks coming together to see themselves as one body from whom each individual might go out into a different denomination. That is what we're going to see in the First Great Awakening, a serious moment where all of these different groups come together for the sake of a single preacher preaching the gospel and evangelizing. Okay, so who are the players? Well, they are, as we've already said, George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. Now, we had an entire video on Jonathan Edwards and his life and some elements of his theology, so we're not going to rehash all of those pieces here. We've looked a little bit at the life of George Whitefield, but we only really looked at George Whitefield in relationship to John Wesley on the subject of predestination. We need to understand where he's coming from and some of the rationale and some of the impulses and instincts that Whitefield has as a revival preacher. Whitefield was born in 1714, and he died in 1770. He was born in the city of Gloucester. His family, like the Wesleys, had a large number of children. Whitefield was the fifth of 17 children, to be exact. And we've already looked at the story in brief, but he goes on to the University of Oxford, where he is actually a poor student. He is what they call, by translation at least, a server. He's not there on scholarship, and the way he would work his way through the universities and the way he would pay his fees is he would do things that frankly made him the butler of the more wealthy students. He'd take out their trash, he'd shine their shoes, he'd draw their bath, and sometimes he'd serve them at table. Now, this was, again, seen as a bit of a scholarship, a work scholarship, and he certainly was getting a wonderful education, but he was certainly part of the have-nots and not part of the haves. He joins the Holy Club, of course, and he becomes a good friend of Charles Wesley. And we've covered a lot of this, of course, but in the 1730s, when John Wesley goes down to Savannah, it is George Whitefield who takes over the Holy Club for a period of time. At this point, Wesley and Whitefield actually are somewhat ships passing the night, as Wesley fails in the city of Savannah, and he heads back to London, where he takes part in the Aldersgate revival with the Moravians, the thing that led to his conversion. During that same time, in 1738, Whitefield himself comes down to Savannah. He serves as a pastor and as a social worker, we might say, though not in terms of social work as we might say today, which is often more political. In this case, he is a pastor leading a group of transplanters from England to the New World, to Georgia, helping them understand and develop a culture of how they're going to serve each other. One of the more important things that Whitefield gets involved with is the planting of a number of orphanages for the poor there in Georgia. Later in his career, he will actually be involved with planting an orphanage for those who were the children of slaves. And there are any number of reasons why children would be very vulnerable in this day and age. Whitefield plays a part in establishing an orphanage for slave children. One of the more enduring ones that he plants, though, is called the Bethesda Orphanage. Now, the Bethesda Orphanage is actually still in existence today. Actually, it is the single longest charitable organization in the entire history of America. It's gone through a number of different names. More recently, it was called the Bethesda School for Boys, though it has since changed its name. But this is in the city of Savannah, and Whitefield is very committed to looking after orphan children. So he is there in Savannah, again in 1738, preaching, pastoring, and engaging in social work. He then travels up and down the eastern coast. In particular, he makes his way to New England, where he meets Jonathan Edwards and a number of the New England Calvinist pastors, the Puritan pastors that are in the areas in Boston and in the surrounding Massachusetts areas. And Whitefield begins to press himself into the service of revivalistic preaching here in America. He had done a great deal of this back in England. Up and down the country, he had preached revival, often to the poor and to anyone who would come out and see him. Well, he begins to do this in North America, and he has a great deal of success, and there's a great deal of fruit that comes out of this. He would preach outdoors at times to thousands and thousands of people. Now, historians always comment, according to stories and accounts of Whitefield's preaching from his own day, from eyewitness men and women who had gone to hear him preach, Whitefield was graced with some kind of staggeringly massive, booming, rich voice that could carry not to the back of the rafters per se in a closed auditorium, but could somehow fill a field so that thousands of people listening to him could still hear his voice and could be drawn in to the power of his preaching. He had a lot of natural gifts, we might say, in the modern world. And Whitefield, again, would ride up and down the coast. He would be saddle sore, thousands upon thousands of miles, preaching to thousands upon thousands of people. His goal in all this was to preach evangelism, to preach the new birth, to preach the goal of the Christian life, which is to know Christ and his works. What's important about his revivals, though, is they spark, in part, though principally through his efforts, this first Great Awakening. You might say that these revivals were non-denominational or interdenominational. They brought all kinds of folks together just to hear the preaching of the gospel. Whitefield would simply preach Christ, preach resting on him and his works on the cross. And then he would hold out the opportunity for folks to make a commitment to Christ at the end of his preaching. He very often liked to end his sermons with the following, quote, "Come poor, undone sinner, come just as you are." And again, the reaction to Whitefield's preaching was always pretty staggering. None other than Ben Franklin himself went to hear Whitefield preach. And Ben, of course, is a deist. He doesn't really care all that much about faith. He himself is a man of science, and he's really certainly part of this more radical enlightenment that is underway. And Franklin actually says specifically about hearing Whitefield preach that he was mesmerized, that he found it pretty startling and actually very intriguing. He also makes a comment that really helps us understand what's going on here. Again, the context is of a loosening or a slacking of the faith in the New World, whether it's through opulence or indulgence, whether it's through just simply not finding the faith all that compelling, whatever it might be. Well, Ben Franklin actually says that, quote, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious. Now, what does he mean here? Well, clearly, one of the things that he means is that it's not a very religious world. This is not a time of deep, passionate religious fervor. However, the Great Awakening is bringing some of this to bear here in the First Great Awakening. And again, it's really becoming a melting pot. Whitefield is preaching revival in a way that is bringing folks together for the sake of the faith and for the sake of increasing the faith amongst those who have grown lukewarm and of bringing back to the faith any who might have slipped away. And so Whitefield is, again, some of the propellant that pushes some of the Great Awakening forward. Jonathan Edwards, though, is himself one of the great supporters of the Great Awakening. And we mentioned some of this in our lecture on his life. He was really concerned about the integrity of the faith in New England. And he begins himself almost single-handedly to spark a revival or a Great Awakening in the city of Boston and surrounding Massachusetts areas, in particular the city of Northampton. Edwards' sermons were simply riveting for people listening to him in his day. And we should really stress that point because in the modern world, whenever people go back and read the sermons of Jonathan Edwards, its language is a bit more philosophical, its vocabulary a bit more remote from the modern world. He's very much an 18th century man, and the sermons, therefore, sound very 18th century. And this always makes people scratch their heads. Why in the world would this lead to a revival? Well, the answer in part is that in Edwards' day, he was speaking in language and in vocabulary that everyone could accept or embrace without much difficulty. One of the more interesting things about Edwards, though, is he really presses into his people that they should rely less and less on things called special providences, which in our vocabulary we might say are miracles, or little moments where God breaks in and changes things to be for our advantage or for our edification. Edwards, of course, is more of a man of science, and he appeals to the people, and he argues for them to consider God as the one who is through all and in all. It's not that God has sort of wound up the clock and allowed the universe to spin on its own, and he shows up from time to time here and there to give little moments of special providence. What Edwards stressed, in a typical Protestant vein, was that God is in everything. He is the sustainer as well as the provider. He shows up, yes, from time to time, but he is also the one who is very ordinary. He is in the natural world. He's in the home life. He's in everything that we do and say or speak. And therefore, we need to seek the glorification of God in everything, not simply wait around for the miracles. He also stressed very, very strongly that God can be known. He's not far off. He's not the eternal watchmaker far off in the sky. He is here in every moment, and he can be known intimately, and that is the goal of the Christian life. In the end, the Great Awakening here, just prior to the Revolutionary War, does seem to, again, bring together elements and all different denominations into these revivals that were short-lived, sure, but which had a dramatic impact because of the accent that American evangelicalism will forever place on revivals, big tent preaching, and the widespread call for everyone to come to the faith. In their own day, though, in the early to mid-18th century, these preachers and this revivalistic preaching did not always strike people as the best thing for the church. One of the great problems, of course, of revival preaching, or of a revival movement at any point in the church's history, is that there are usually, very often, no clear guidelines as to where emotionalism ends and where ecstatic, somewhat crazy excess begins. And this is true across denominations and branches of the church. If a movement begins with more ecstatic, spontaneous emotional outbursts, at times there are folks who will come along either to mimic that process or who, in the midst of the revivals themselves, will simply be unaware or unable to tell the difference between excess and an appropriate amount of emotional expression. So a great example of this is the Tennant family, as well as a man by the name of James Davenport. These folks, having heard the revival preaching, having supported it themselves, began to set about to really stoke up the revivals to an even greater extent than they had been done in the area of New England and in the preaching of George Whitefield. And just to give you a little bit of a taste as to some of the excesses, James Davenport is actually eventually arrested, and he is charged with insanity and with disturbing the peace. Something of a humorous outcome, but it's actually quite unfortunate because James Davenport is again simply trying to mimic the emotional preaching of the revivals, and he got out so far over his skis that he eventually took it too far. This is always the problem with a revivalistic movement, and it's not the ultimate problem, and it's certainly not the Achilles heel, but this is always something that comes up. Where does one end and where does one begin with emotions versus a more ordinary, commonplace, day-by-day faith? Not everything can be hyper emotions and ecstatic experiences. God is the God of the ordinary as well. Well, what happens in the American colonies is this distinction and this problem actually begins to lead to a split. It is called the split between the old lights and the new lights, which is just simply a marker for the old lights or those who are relatively opposed to revival preaching, sometimes very hostile or mocking of those who take part in revival preaching, versus the new lights, people like Wesley and Whitefield, who are in favor of revivals and evangelism. And they are relatively, I wouldn't say anti-institutional, but they are certainly in favor of people coming as they are, in whatever form, whatever denomination they happen to be a part of, to hear the preaching of the gospel. So you're beginning to see a division between those who want to keep the established ways of doing church before, run by elders or bishops or other types of pastors, versus the new lights who, again, begin to take on a tone of something of the anti-establishment. And so, in the end, the Great Awakening contributed so much good to the life of the church. It gave evangelicalism its first great expression of emotional piety and revival preaching. But it also led to a split. And, more importantly, it was always fundamentally ambiguous as to who holds the power. Is it in the preachers? Is it in the people? Or is it back in the churches? Once the big revivals are over, these folks stream back and submit themselves to the discipline of the elders or to the bishop. And as we'll see as we go forward into our next lecture on the American Revolution and the church, that ambiguity, that tension, was a live one in the American colonies. And so as the American Revolution gets underway, and as it spills out into the post-revolutionary constitutional era of America, the impact on the church and its anti-institutionalism will only grow deeper.